Greetings, good people, and welcome back to Choice Words. I am your host, Jay Artis-Wright with Freedom to Choose Schools. And today we have a very special guest with us. His name is Dr. Jon Carroll, who is founder of Jubilee Academy, set to open in August of 2026 in Inglewood, California. What ties Dr. Carroll into our podcast today is the creating space for identity and culture in our schools. And I will allow Dr. Carroll to share a little bit more about what that means. But before we get into that, Dr. Carroll, introduce yourself to our guests and let us know a little bit more about you.
Well, thank you. And Jay, first of all, I appreciate you having me on your platform to talk a little bit about this passion project of mine. Like you said, my name is Jon Carroll. I'm a East Coast native, Philadelphia born and raised, and made the move to California about 22 years ago. And I've been in education all my life. I like to say it's the family business. I come from two school district of Philadelphia educators, and even though they wanted me to hopefully become an MD one day, I, bumped around, and after taking organic chemistry, realized that education was really the path for me. And so after being in independent schools for the better part of the last 25 years, once my son graduated high school last year, it really provided a great opportunity to go off and do something that I've been thinking about and has been on my heart for a number of years, and that's to start an institution that was based in a community that didn't have the same kinds of opportunities as where I was working. And so thus is the birth of Jubilee Academy. We're really excited about the progress that we've made so far as we get ready to open in August.
I am so glad to hear that and super excited for you. And you didn't become an MD, but you definitely are a doctor. So let's give you your praise for that. So they shouldn't be too disappointed with you. Before we move forward into Jubilee Academy, I'm curious because I know you did your dissertation, which I love the name. The dissertation was Guess Who's Coming to the Classroom? Is that what it was?
Yes, yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Which is a playoff of Sidney Poitier's movie. For any of y'all out there who are too young to remember this, Sidney Poitier was in a movie, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, where he was dating a white woman, and he, obviously being a black man, came to dinner to meet her family. So, Guess Who's Coming to the Class and examining the pedagogy of black male teacher education. Tell us a little bit more about that, if you don't mind.
Well, for me, it was really important to kind of understand the ways that in a workforce that is predominantly and has been predominantly female dominated and white woman dominated for the last, 50 to 70 years, how are we making sure that there is a training component that prepares them to work with urban communities in particular, and black and brown students even more specific. And if I can be really honest, when I started my grad work, I was really focused on black boys because there was such a narrative around their criminalization and suspension rates and being over disciplined and over policed and all those different things. And so I happened to be able to study at the feet of a great teacher educator, and I really wanted to understand the ways that he set about making sure that teachers understood the kinds of knowledge and understanding they would need to go into classrooms and be able to connect with students and therefore be able to teach them. So that's where that work came from, and it grew to me, wanting to better understand the ways that teachers pick their curriculum and choose pieces that are going to allow for connection in the classroom.
All right. Well, I am so glad to hear you say that and glad that you are doing that work. I think it's really important for people to understand what you just named. First, the teachers union, over 80% of the teachers union population are white women. And, we often quote that statistic to just show how there's such an imbalance in who actually gets in front of our kids. And also, we talk about the value of the impact that having a teacher that mirrors your identity has for you. For example, if a Black student has a teacher of color for at least two times throughout their academic career, it raises their chances by 32% that they can go off to college. That is a huge margin And in our world, we always talk about numbers. I really feel like that in itself is a value indicator that we should be exploring when we talk about standards and teaching and the profession overall. And we don't. And to see people like you understand that, value that, and have not only that, but the professional acumen behind it to say, wait a minute, there's something here that we're missing is so incredible. And I'm, again, I can't tell you how overwhelmed and how excited I am to see this now move into your own school, Jubilee Academy. So let's talk about that, Jubilee Academy. What does the name mean? Does the name have meaning?
Yeah, it does. So, much like any other school that, represents an affinity group or a religious background, I wanted you, when you heard the name Jabali, to immediately be thinking of something from the continent. And so Jabali is a Swahili word that means strong as a rock or just rock. And so it really was a word that aligns with the way that I see schools. I really have come to believe that schools can be the cornerstone of a community, not just for what happens during the school day hours, but what happens outside of them and the programming that they can provide. So it really is a word that lines up and is in sync with how I envision the role of schools and communities.
Okay, and then it's in Inglewood, California. Was Inglewood on purpose? Was there a reason why you chose Inglewood?
Inglewood was very much on purpose. So I have lived my last 22 years now in the Los Angeles area in what's known as the San Fernando Valley. So we're talking about, if you've been to LA, about 40 minutes north of LAX. And so in living in the valley, I've come to see and experience, really, because I'm a parent, as I mentioned, that you have a almost an oversaturation of independent school opportunities. I like to say that some of the top destination schools, independent schools in the Los Angeles area, are in the San Fernando Valley. So, I used to work at Harvard Westlake School, which is a noted school in the,
Mhm.
and there are multiple others within 2 miles of that campus. But the same isn't true down in Inglewood. And so I had the privilege of serving on admissions committee at Harvard Westlake for a number of years, and we would see students apply from all over, and we really touted our ability to draw students from over 100 zip codes. And so for me, while that was a source of pride, and I took great pride in making sure that once families came to Harvard Westlake, that they had a good experience, I also started to think about what are families sacrificing when they are spending over 3 hours both ways in the car. What is not what connections are being lost in the community when students and their families are spending so much time away from where they live. And so it got me to looking at the map and just thinking about where it would be ideal to place such a school. And Inglewood really stood out, not only because there aren't as many independent school opportunities, but schools were closing. So there have been a number of school closures in Inglewood for a number of reasons. But at the same time, Inglewood is experiencing this renaissance. You have Inglewood getting ready to host, the World Cup. You have Inglewood being almost, on the precipice of hosting the Olympics in 2028. Inglewood, because of the revitalization of the Forum, which used to host the Lakers, is now a vibrant concert venue. So, in the midst of this entertainment and hospitality and athletic renaissance, I felt like if you're really going to have a community that benefits from all that foot traffic, then you got to have good schools. And so it really became a place that I zeroed in on. And we were fortunate enough to find a building that we could, make our home. And we've been, doing that since this summer.
Well, I am thrilled to hear that for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is when I first started off in my career, I actually worked as an education consultant in the California Senate for Senator Ed Vincent, who was the first Black mayor of Inglewood, of all things. So you talk about full circle, and had this whole vision for what we are seeing happening in Inglewood right now. He was not only the first Black mayor, but he actually was an NFL player for the Los Angeles Rams, like way, way back in the day. And I mean,
And he has a park named after him now.
yes, yes, I do. I do. And so this is full circle for me because I was a small education consultant, legislative aide, working for him in the state senate, talking about the value of education. I know Inglewood's history of education overall, and so to see the type of caliber that you're trying to bring to Inglewood at this time is so profound and so perfect. And again, giving credit to what we see happening in San Fernando Valley with Westlake and some of the other institutions there. You are so spot on with what you're saying. I mean, so many of us specifically who have the privilege to be able to go to prep schools have to have that trade-off of driving in traffic 3 hours one way at some in some cases if they're going down the 405, right? We try to avoid the 405. For those of you who don't know, 405 is the freeway in Los Angeles that is literally, bred for traffic all day long, no matter what happens. So this is another opportunity for people to realize that even when you do have the privilege or the ability to go to a prestigious school, things like transportation and access are often limiting. And so, again, just completely, applaud you for taking your vision and bringing it into a community that needs it, that deserves it, and quite frankly, it's probably going to show out and give Westlake a little run for its money, and soon, I'm sure. So let me ask you another question, because one of the things you didn't mention when you were talking is your background in athletics as well. You were a swimmer, correct?
I grew up a swimmer, so my mother never learned how. And on top of that, I was born with asthma, and so that became an immediate equation for myself and my brother and sister all had to learn how to swim. We all had to be water safe, and so that blossomed into our whole family. We were a swimming family. I swam all through high school, swam 3 years in college at the University of Pennsylvania, and then it was funny, it provided for the opportunity to have my first job. I was a lifeguard for many years, and then when I moved to California, we moved in January of '04, my wife and I, and so that's clearly the middle of the school year, so wasn't necessarily going to fall right into a teaching gig, and so I found work as a swim coach, which ultimately led to me becoming the head coach of the club that I was working for, Team Santa Monica, and the next thing you know, it was a career, and so while I was in grad school. I was the head swim coach, and that was what sustained me. And I had the great privilege of developing and working with swimmers who ultimately went to some of the highest swim meets in the country, including the Olympic trials. And so that really laid the foundation for me being a leader of an organization. I remember my grad school mentor, whose daughter was also on the swim team, would often joke with me and say, "You're already leading a school. It's just a swimming based school. Like you've already are developing the skills necessary for when you go back into education to be able to do that." And so I do find that very much to be the case now, as I grab the reins, leading Jubilee Academy. And even as I was developing and working in the different, other school spaces that I was in, there were many lessons learned that could be applied. And so, yeah, swimming has been a very much a part of the fabric of who I am. When we talk about Jabali Academy, it is one of those things that proves to me that if you have a great foundation in who you are, you can go into any arena and still, have confidence and not feel like you are less than or don't deserve to be there. We talk about imposter syndrome sometimes. I grew up on a swim team that was predominantly black, the Philadelphia Department of Recreation swim team under the leadership of Jim Ellis. And so having that, there was no space that we went to as a team or later when I was a coach that, I didn't feel like I was supposed to be there, despite oftentimes being the only black person on the pool deck.
That is, that just made me think about something, because you just named something that we often miss, and it's about having access to excellence that people often don't see. And it reminds me of another guest that we had that talked about how Black people specifically have excellence in us. It's ingrained in us from the start. It's just a matter of us getting the access to those things to help us further with that excellence. So, I can only imagine what it was like to be on a swim team where all of your teammates looked like you, right? And being able to go out and pursue that, the confidence that that gave, just in setting the stage for that, is amazing. That's really powerful. I wanted to ask you, because you said you were sports and then you translated into coaching. How do you think any of that, or does any of that, directly influence your educational work and what you plan on bringing to Jabali?
Oh, absolutely, because that work in swimming really showed the crossover between kind of traditional classroom education and what you can learn, being an athlete. There are lessons learned being an athlete that I carry with me from those early years being a swimmer. You learn as a swimmer and the life that you have to lead. Oftentimes practice before school, then practice after school, to be disciplined and to manage your time effectively. You learn about consistency. You learn about, resiliency in many cases. Like you work and work and work, and you hope that all that hard work will result in you swimming faster. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. So how do you pick yourself up off the mat and do it all over again? So the lessons I learned in athletics certainly translate and are part of my vision for Jabali. We want to have a robust extracurricular program. I see the same lessons, that I learned as a swimmer, translate into what I see others do in the arts, and I happen to be and continue to be a visual and performing arts and what they mean for school community life. So all of that work kind of outside of the classroom, when combined with my educational background, just inform the kind of school community that I, hope to bring to bear with Jabali.
Indeed, that is a lot. And you kind of segue to the next question I have for you, which is the weight of being disciplined and responsible with also with the joy of winning, the joy of community, the joy of team. How do you balance that weight and joy? And how do you see yourself balancing that specifically with Black educators as you carry this forward?
Yeah, I think it's important that there's joy throughout because that's what keeps you inspired. That's what keeps you trying to do new things. If you're not having that joy, if it's looked at as a job or a chore, then I tend to find it to be very limiting, and that has certainly played out in my experiences with young people. And certainly when you're thinking about elementary students, Jabali is going to be a K to 8 school. When you have kindergartners and first graders coming in the door, the joy and the wonder that they have is something that you want to build upon. It's certainly not that light that you want to squelch. And so we very much want to make sure that we are doing things that are developmentally appropriate and that are going to inspire that joy and wonder, and not expose students too early to the things that are hard or difficult to grapple with mentally. So we want to make sure, I often talk about when I do open houses, we want to make sure we're laying a wonderful foundation upon which a wonderful house can be built. And that house is the student's mind and their outlook on the world. And I think it's really important to the mission of the school that within that academic rigor, we're also weaving in that identity piece so that they know themselves and they know that wherever they go, not only are they capable, but they're worthy. And too often when we're in these spaces, and I'm speaking about, Black people in particular, when we're in spaces where we find ourselves kind of isolated, we are led to believe that we don't deserve to be there. And that's not the case.
So you spent over 20 years in education, have an extensive career, obviously working in education and coaching and mentoring. What made you say now is the time to build my own school?
Yeah, you get to the place in your career where you want to have the next challenge. And so I had had the privilege for the last decade or so of being what they call a grade level dean at my school, which was a wonderful position for me in that it allowed me to work 360 degrees with families. And so, whereas when I first started at Harvard Westlake in particular, I was just a swim coach. And so the focus was on athletics. When I became a dean, that opened up the rest of things because I was not only concerned with what a student did outside the classroom, but I knew what they were doing in the classroom. I had to have relationships with their families. So anything that had an impact on that student, I had to know about it, and it really enhanced the way I see education, the way I was able to function as an educator. And so, having really done that role, and I feel like I excelled in that role for a number of years, you start looking at what the next challenge is, and there just weren't the opportunities that were available. And so I began to think more and more about what do I need to be doing, given all that has been given to me. We talk about teacher education population, on the inverse, the population of Black male educators has been about 2%, for the
Mhm.
last God knows how many years. And so, given that privilege that I have, I started to think about what could I be doing more with all that I've been giving. And so, starting an institution became a growing idea in my head, and I had to get around the fact that I hadn't come up as a fundraiser in particular. That was something that I always thought about. But given the times that we now live in, where we're seeing the active erasure of Black history and the active suppression of citizenship, I felt it was just too important to have institutions that preserve our well-being to not make that leap. And it just so happened that with my son graduating from high school this past year, it was a nice point to make a period on my time and go off on my own.
Well, as someone who just barely met you, but it has been very impressed with you, let me just say I am very proud of you.
I appreciate that. I say it all the time now on this journey. All affirmations are welcome because
Of
it is no
course,
small task.
it's no simple task, and the reality of it is that some people will say it's an uphill. Uh, I don't want to say burden, but with what you just described, especially with what we're seeing on, an attempt on a large national scale to have anti-DEI erased from our education, to erase Black history in the way, in the context of which we know it, to help our students. You're in for a fight, and
Sure.
um, and it's good to see fighters in this space because I often tell people, tiger doesn't change its stripes. Like I can't shed this and do anything other than this. And the work that I've been doing in this space is important and is valuable, probably more so now than ever, because they are trying to do exactly what we've fought so long to not have happen and continue to pursue. But the other thing about it, I'm going to ask you about this, is it's so important for people to know our education, not because it's our education, ours being Black people, but it's because it's our education, us as Americans in this country. Um, and one of the things that I love about your curriculum is that it's African centered curriculum. Africa is a birthplace to mathematics, science, philosophy, civilization. That is something that affects all of us. And people don't even know that the birthplace was Africa. um, I'm curious to know, knowing that you know this, how are you going to balance? How will you balance the curriculum of traditional academic rigor alongside of the global African lens?
Yeah, well, the important thing for us is to realize, and we've found this in our open houses and our admissions events already, is that all families, Black families in particular, want their kids to be able to read, write, and do math. They want to have those core skills. And so before you talk about any of the other things, that are wonderful and that we know are necessary, they want to make sure that those bases are covered. And so we will be making sure that we are aligned with the standards for California and national standards, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that when students leave us, whenever they do, that they can go off to the next destination and thrive and be able to continue to have success. So, yes, we're going to make sure that folks understand the contributions of the continent and the diaspora, but we're going to weave that within a rigorous academic framework. And we believe that by doing that, it only enhances the academic experience. So it's one thing to understand different events in American history, for example, but if you can parallel and connect those events to those happening throughout the world, that's only going to deepen the understanding of certain themes, right? So, we are living in a time when there is, this neo imperialism, for example, that's taking place. And so that's certainly something that you can understand from an African context, and you look at many of the nations on the continent. But that is also something that, quite frankly, the American project has been involved in as well. And we have to be honest about that and understand that, so that students ultimately learn, how to combat that for the greater good of us all.
And now you mentioned 2 decades in education, and obviously you worked at some of the most prestigious schools. You graduated from the University of Penn. You worked at Westlake. You've got this discipline in coaching. You've got this discipline in swimming. I'm curious. And then we also talked about systems, right? And the fact that this is institutional, which is also a good point to mention, that you are institutionalizing this in the form of education. I'm curious to know, what were some of the gaps that you've seen in our existing system that you just felt like were just too broad or just weren't enough, that you felt like, I got to do this myself?
People need to understand that that is a lot of what drives me, is that, you find yourself in a system that, while you can make some progress within, you're never going to remake it altogether. It's too ingrained, it's too entrenched, that we are seeing that there are forces that want to maintain that status quo by any means necessary. And so one of the things that I feel like my education has blessed me with is the exposure to know that folks have done it differently before. Folks continue to do it differently, in terms of having institutions that serve their communities and make sure that they are well. And so the first one I'll give you is curriculum. I feel like, when it comes to Black students, and I have colleagues who have, done this work, for their communities as well. But for Black students, there's just not that exposure, and connecting, a Black existence into the what we call the canon, or the traditional main narrative that goes with history, English, science, math, no matter what the core subject. Oftentimes the Black contribution to those disciplines is left out. And so I've had the pleasure of engaging, colleagues to help them understand where that inclusion will enhance curriculum, and have, had success in doing that. But ultimately, you come to question whether it is better to fight those many battles, one at a time, and take some wins and losses, or if you just reimagine the whole thing. And so again, I just got to a place where I wanted to reimagine the whole thing. The second thing is a much bigger, macro thing, which is funding. I find that traditionally the ways that we are funding education is flawed, and ultimately has a disparate negative effect on Black and Brown communities. And so, again, you worked in Inglewood, like, when we tie so much funding to testing, for example, it makes for this competition for in order to gain resources. And so for me, knowing that, I wanted to create a system where you didn't have to do so much of that, and the funding, could come from within communities, so it could go towards the things that are going to benefit students. I feel like a lot of times when you're looking at larger public school systems, there's a lot of bloat and a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape, where there's money, but it's not getting to the places that it needs to get to, which is our students.
Yeah, and that's a good segue, because I was going to ask you. You recently did a fundraiser, empowering minds, and you did it at the Skirball Center, and you
Mhm.
raised a pretty substantial amount of dollars with that fundraiser. What did that moment signal to you about community support, and are you in the right path?
Oh, that meant everything for us to, be introducing ourselves in this venture, to not only just kind of our village, but to a wider public, and to get such support. It meant everything. It meant that we're on the right track. It meant that there's belief. It meant that there's, again, affirmation of a vision that I have, and support for it to keep going, and that there would be, an army behind me to make sure that it didn't fail. So that, first fundraiser and the subsequent ones that we have done since, they mean everything, because they show that there is a willingness to invest in the future of young people who are, not even necessarily known, but that there is a belief that, and an understanding that education can have a significant impact on the trajectory of young people. And so when you invest in it, you are making sure that they will stay on a path towards success.
Yeah, and I really like the way that you're moving, and I don't know if it's because, being in Southern California, you're kind of at the epicenter of like Hollywood, and as you mentioned, Inglewood specifically is coming its own sports mecca with all the different industries there. But you had this event, and it was hosted by Ron G, featured a performance by Major. How does culture, art, and entertainment amplify this educational movement in your mind?
Well, again, you mentioned we're in Hollywood, and so we have the blessing to be able to be in community with those kinds of folks who are artists and creatives, because that is a lot of what is around, particularly when you think about Black communities in Hollywood. And so we're able to tap into that, and it's a wonderful thing because it draws in people, and you're able to get their stories about why and how education is important. And so we're blessed in that way because it allows us to draw people in a way that perhaps if we were in New York, for example, might be a little different. Even though New York is also home to a creative kind of epicenter. So maybe that's not the best idea example, but let's say Maine. So we would definitely have to do it different if we were someplace else. But being in and around Hollywood really allows for us to draw on all of that creative energy and show the different ways that it can manifest. So, for example, my wife, who is a creator and who's done amazing things in Hollywood and has been a history maker in that space, started off her career as an economist. She, went to Penn. We both went to the University of Pennsylvania, and she worked for many years at the Federal Reserve Bank before, pivoting. And so I tell that story to say that, when you are amongst creatives, you find that the path is not always just straight and narrow, and it provides some excellent windows for young people and young families to see, how they can get from point A to B, it takes some windy path.
What would your younger self, if having this opportunity to go to Jubilee Academy, what would this experience have been like for you?
Oh, I love that question because I think about it all the time. And so the thing that comes immediately to mind is I would have had a much greater appreciation for the contributions of the continent, and I would have certainly been itching to experience it and its richness much earlier in my life, than I have. And so one of the best examples I can give you is like I remember the first time I went and saw the play that canonizes Fela Kuti's life. And so Fela Kuti is this amazing, he's the godfather of Afrobeats,
Mhm.
for a short, quick bio. And so just experiencing that music and the richness of it, I would have been hooked, and I would have wanted to know where that came from. I would have wanted to know and experience it even more. And then learning that story would have connected to my understanding of a lot of the civil rights freedom fighters. And so I would have just had a much greater and richer, wider worldview than I had growing up. And again, I grew up as someone who had certainly educational privilege, like growing up under two teachers who were very wedded to the idea of education as upliftment. Like they did everything to culturally enrich my brother and sister and I's experience. But with this kind of education that I'm looking to provide, it would have been enhanced with that kind of greater diasporic piece. And so that's what
Mhm.
we're looking to make sure that families understand. Like it is one thing to, come to enjoy and believe in the greatness of Beyonce, for example. But then what is the South African Beyonce? What is the Nigerian? What does the Ghanaian version look like? And how do they all come together and influence one another? We were just talking about sports and entertainment. What is it like to have opportunities on the continent to extend careers in tech, in sports, in business, for the greater good of us all? So that is something that I think about all the time and really drives me because I want young Black children to understand that their existence and their success is not simply tied to a domestic life. It is one that can have there are global opportunities that are available for them.
I am smiling so big because you mentioned Fela Kuti, who a lot of people probably don't even know who Fela Kuti is, believe it or not. And he is someone you described him. He's the godfather of Afro beats. He's also probably the motivator of people like Sly and the Family Stone and some of the early. I mean, his concerts were amazing. So you just hit a nice little part in my heart when you mentioned that name because he just was a brilliant civil rights activist, entertainer,
Mhm.
I mean, I think about people like Prince and Bootsy Collins. I think all those people took something from Fela, like that, just the big stage with the dancing and all the performances, and at the same
And
time,
he took stuff from James Brown, like that's in the
yes,
play. So like, it shows you it's a really good example of the global connection that expands beyond borders.
right, 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 and you're right, and we're connected in so many ways because people will look at that and not realize the influence that the continent has still had on us here in America, and vice versa. I hope that's one of your classes. That'd be awesome.
It will definitely be part of our music and performing arts. Like, again, the beauty of having this opportunity is that we can expand the canon in ways that other, institutions may not see fit, but we definitely see the benefit of.
Well, it sounds like an amazing school, and it's set to open this year, this fall, August 2026. When those doors open, what moment do you think will hit you the hardest emotionally?
Oh, it's going to be the students walking into the classroom on that first day, just seeing that something that was an idea. My wife would tell you that it's been an idea for as long as she's known me, but certainly became real, and that I've really leaned into pursuing probably over the last 5 years, coming to fruition with students actually walking in the door with Jubilee Academy gear on, accompanied by their parents and in some cases their village. Seeing that, I know I'm going to be emotional. It's going to be an emotional first day, but I look forward to it because I've already been just so heartened by folks who've said yes and who've committed and say, I like this vision that you're putting forth. We want to be a part of that, and we want to, see this win for the benefit of you and our children.
Yeah, well, look, I hope I get an invitation to the first day or the second day or the 100th day, because I can see this just from your heart and your passion. I would love to see it in person. I've got one final question.
Hit me.
So let me ask you, Dr. Carroll, like if you had to leave our listeners right now with a few choice words, what would they be? What would you want us to know?
My choice words would be that communities, and I'm talking about family, so at the family level, need to come together to make choices, play on words, about what is right for their communities and their children. It has been proven over and over again that this government has a bent towards dismantling education or suppressing education for communities of color. And so they need to come together to make their voices heard about the ways in which they want to protect the right for their children to be educated. And like you say, there are many options. I'm doing an independent school one. I'm not someone who is vehemently anti-charter, vehemently anti-public school. My parents were public school educators. I graduated from a magnet public high school in Philly. So I'm not anti any one version of school, but I do believe in the opportunity for families to make the best choice for their children. And so that has to happen not at just the individual level, but at the community level, so folks can advocate for opportunities that make the most sense for them, whether it is better public schools, whether it is, additional charter schools, whether it is supporting independent schools. That's up to, communities themselves. And we live in a time where over and over again, we're seeing what the power of community development can do. So that's my choice words. Thank you for the opportunity for that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carroll, and thank you to all of our listeners. We hope that you have been inspired and enlightened and educated a little bit about what is happening not only in Inglewood, California, but across this country. Thank you again, Dr. Carroll. This is Choice Words with Freedom to Choose Schools. I'm your host, Jay Artis-Wright, and we look forward to the next episode.